Hey, I'm Amy, and up next in my Friday Favorite series is the podcast episode Been There, Done That from the Home Cooking Podcast. The Home Cooking Podcast was started back at the beginning of the COVID quarantine times in March 2020, and part of me hesitated to include this in my list of favorites, in part because of all of the COVID references. They can be a difficult reminder of a really hard time. But when I put those memories aside, I really do want to mention this podcast as one of my favorites because it was and still is. Samin Nosrat is one of the hosts, and you may know her from her book, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, and her Netflix series of the same name. And Samin brings so much joy to discussions about food, and it's infectious. In fact, back when I first heard this podcast in late 2020, I was dealing with some chronic headaches, and I noticed that listening to this podcast was a time when I had relief from the headaches. It tapped into joy for me. I was reminded of this experience recently when I was listening to a podcast about chronic pain and how pursuing joy is part of the healing journey. I can share more info about that on another Friday, but for now, back to this Friday favorite, the episode Been There, Done That. If you recall, back in the early days of the pandemic, we were trying to minimize going to the grocery store, and that resulted in a lot more cooking at home with basic pantry items like dried beans. And while I'm thankful that we're no longer restricting trips to the grocery store, cooking at home is still a great thing to do. I often spend time talking with my patients through how to fit more home cooking into busy lives. I love listening in to this casual discussion of ingredients and everyday foods. It taps into the curiosity and fun of home cooking. So give this episode a listen and let me know what you've been cooking lately.